The chill of the memorial grounds wasn't as cold as the laughter of the guards. They mocked the old man, Robert, and his faded, worn cap. They saw a vagrant, not a veteran. But they laughed, until Colonel Andrew saw the small, tarnished badge pinned just above the brim, and his entire body snapped to attention. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like it, and comment where you're watching from. You know, the thing about memory is that it breathes. It's not just locked away in your head. It lives in the air of certain places, in the scent of pine needles on a cold walkway, or in the sharp, metallic clang of a flagpole lanyard hitting the pole in a 30-mile-an-hour wind. And if you ever want to feel the weight of shared memory, you go to a place like this, a national war memorial, a place built of granite and silence. It was on exactly such a morning, a Tuesday in late October, when the air was cold enough to steal your breath and the sky was the color of dull steel, that Robert arrived. He didn't arrive in a tour bus or with a family tow. He came on the 7:15 a.m. city bus, the one that smelled faintly of disinfectant and diesel. You would have seen him get off, wincing just a little as his feet hit the pavement. Robert was, to put it plainly, an old man, not the vibrant, jogging in the park kind of old. The other kind. The kind where gravity has won the argument. His coat, a faded olive-drab field jacket from a war fought before the next two wars, was clean but hopelessly frayed at the cuffs. His trousers were worn thin at the knees, and his shoes, well, his shoes looked like they had walked 1,000 miles more than they were ever designed for. But it was the cap that defined him. A simple, faded baseball cap, the color of which might have once been navy blue, but was now a mottled gray. It was pulled low, shadowing eyes that had seen too much daylight. He held no map. He held no camera. He just held onto the strap of a small, empty canvas bag slung over his shoulder, his knuckles white. The memorial park was quiet at this hour. Just the sound of the wind, that insistent click-click-clack of the lanyard, and the distant hum of the capital city waking up. Robert moved slowly, his gait uneven, a slight hitch in his left hip that made every step a negotiation. He wasn't looking at the grand arches or the reflecting pools. He was looking through them, toward the long, dark wall of names that waited in the center of it all. He was on a pilgrimage, you see, and pilgrimages are never easy. You have to understand the kind of cold it was. It wasn't a blizzard. It was a damp, invasive cold that got into your bones, the kind that made young men stamp their feet and curse under their breath. Which is exactly what George and Edward were doing. You would have found them at the main visitor checkpoint, standing behind a polished aluminum podium trying to look imposing. They were young. George was maybe 22, still carrying a bit of college bulk, his security uniform stretched tight. Edward was leaner, sharper, the kind of young man who mistakes cynicism for intelligence. They were armed, of course, but their real weapon was the boredom of a long shift. To them, this wasn't a sacred space. It was a gig. It was 6 more hours until they could get off their feet and play video games. They were watching the sparse collection of early visitors. A German tourist couple, a high school field trip that hadn't had its coffee yet, and then they saw Robert. George nudged Edward with his elbow, a tiny, almost imperceptible gesture. "Check it out," he murmured, his voice low. "Category 5. Edward allowed himself a small, thin smile. It was their little code. Category 5. A vagrant, a drifter, someone who didn't fit the respectful, camera-ready profile of their usual clientele. Robert was still 100 yards away, moving like a ship against the tide, but their judgment was already set in stone. "Bet you $10 he asks for money," Edward whispered back. George just shook his head. "Nah, he's heading for the wall. Probably thinks it's a homeless shelter." They straightened up as he approached, their postures shifting from boredom to a false, aggressive kind of authority. The air grew just a little colder. Robert saw them, of course. He had seen men like them his entire life. Men in uniforms who held a little bit of power and mistook it for strength. He'd seen them in processing stations in 1968. He'd seen them in VA hospital waiting rooms. And he saw them now, standing between him and the wall. He just wanted to pass. He just wanted to find the name. He kept his head down, hoping to be invisible. A gray ghost in the morning mist, but you're never invisible to bored men with a uniform. As Robert reached the checkpoint, George put out a hand, palm flat, a gesture that was unnecessarily firm. "Hold up, sir. Need to see your bag." Robert stopped, the sudden halt jarring his bad hip. He slowly, painfully unslung the canvas bag and handed it over. He didn't say a word. Edward took it and opened it with a performative sigh, flipping it upside down. Nothing fell out but a brown paper lunch sack, containing a single, slightly bruised apple, and a small, folded plastic poncho. Edward held the empty bag up, looked inside as if expecting to find contraband, and then looked at Robert with that thin, cruel smile. "Traveling light, I see," Edward said, his voice just loud enough for the high schoolers nearby to overhear. Robert just nodded, waiting. George, however, wasn't looking at the bag. He was looking at the cap, the faded, shapeless piece of cloth on the old man's head. "Gotta ask you to take off the cap, sir. Security policy." Robert's head came up just slightly. His eyes, watery and gray, met George's. "It's cold," Robert murmured, his voice a dry rasp. "Policy, sir," George repeated, tapping the brim of his own immaculate security cap. "And honestly, you'd be doing us all a favor. That thing's seen better decades." A few of the high school kids snickered. George felt a small, pathetic rush of power. He was in charge. Robert's hand went to the brim of his cap, his fingers tracing something there, something George and Edward couldn't see. He didn't remove it. He just held it as if steadying himself. "Please," Robert said, and the word was so quiet it was almost lost in the wind. "I just need to see the wall." Edward shoved the bag back into Robert's chest. "Go on then, but we're watching you. Any funny business and you're out, and try to look respectful." Robert flinched at the word as if it were a physical blow. He took his bag, pulled the cap down even lower, and walked past them. The laughter was quiet, but it followed him all the way down the path. Miles away, or perhaps just on the other side of the reflecting pool, another man was starting his day. Colonel Andrew Vance. You need to picture him, because he was the exact opposite of Robert. Where Robert was soft lines and faded colors, Andrew was all sharp angles and defined purpose. His uniform, the Army service uniform, was immaculate. The creases in his trousers could have cut glass. His medals, neatly arranged on his chest, told the story of a life spent in service, in places that were hot and dusty and dangerous. He was in his late 50s, but he moved with the energy of a man 20 years younger. Andrew wasn't just visiting the memorial. He was, in a way, its guardian. He came here twice a week, not as part of an official duty, but as a personal ritual. He walked the perimeter, his eyes scanning every detail, not for security breaches, but for dust, for disrespect, for anything that marred the sanctity of the place. To Andrew, this memorial wasn't just granite, it was a promise. It was the physical manifestation of the debt he felt he owed to the men who didn't come home. He was currently standing near the Korean War statues, his gaze fixed on the haunting, rain-slicked faces of the patrol. He hated the cold, but he embraced the discomfort. It felt appropriate. He checked his watch. 07:45. He would walk the main wall, check in with the Park Service liaison, and then head to the Pentagon. A routine morning. He had no idea that the most significant event of his day, perhaps of his year, was shuffling toward the same wall from the opposite direction, his heart heavy with a purpose Andrew would understand all too well. Robert had left George and Edward far behind, but their words clung to him, heavy and damp like the fog. Look respectful. He wanted to laugh, or perhaps weep. What did they think this was? A social call? He'd been walking toward this wall for 50 years. The journey hadn't started on the 7:15 bus. It had started in a muddy foxhole, in a jungle whose name was now just a chapter in a history book. He reached the apex of the memorial, where the two long, black wings of granite met. The sheer number of names was overwhelming. It was designed to be 58,318. Each one a life. Each one a story cut short, but Robert was only looking for one. He didn't need the directory. He knew the panel and the line number by heart. Panel 23E, line 64. He began the slow walk, his hand tracing the cold stone. A blind man reading a language only he could understand. The polished granite reflected the steel gray sky, and it reflected his own face, distorted and aged, superimposed over the endless rows of the dead. He passed names he didn't know, each one a pang of anonymous grief. The wind was stronger here, whining in the narrow walkway. He finally reached panel 23E. He stopped. His breathing hitched. He stood there for a long time, his body utterly still. He didn't cry. He was long past tears. He just stood, bearing witness. After a minute that stretched into 10, he slowly, painfully, knelt. The cold of the pavement shot through the thin fabric of his trousers right into his bad knee. He didn't care. His fingers, calloused and stiff with arthritis, reached out and traced the chiseled letters, JAMESRSULLIVAN. "Hey, Jimmy," Robert whispered, his voice cracking. I made it. I'm here." George and Edward were on their first patrol of the grounds. The checkpoint was boring, but walking was cold. They were complaining, their breath pluming in front of them. "I swear," George said, pulling his collar tighter, "they keep the thermostat set to Arctic out here. Why do we even have to patrol? The statues aren't going anywhere." Edward, who was scanning the wall, stopped. "Hold up, look." He pointed. "It's him again, the bum." George squinted. There, halfway down the wall, was Robert. He wasn't just looking, he was kneeling. He had his hand on the wall, his head bowed. To you or me, it would have looked like the purest form of grief, a man communing with a ghost. To George and Edward, it looked like a problem. "He's defacing it," Edward said flatly. "Policy is clear. No touching, no leaning, no kneeling in the walkways." George sighed. "Are you serious? He's just kneeling." "It's disorderly," Edward insisted, his voice taking on that sharp, officious edge again. "And he's blocking the path. If one person does it, everyone does it. Come on, let's move him along." George hesitated, just for a second. There was something about the scene, something about the old man's posture that gave him pause, but Edward was already walking, and George, not wanting to look soft, followed him. They increased their pace, their heavy boots sounding loud and aggressive on the stone path. They were two young predators, full of rules and empty of understanding, walking directly toward a man who had forgotten more about sacrifice than they would ever know. The stage was set. The audience, the quiet watching names on the wall, held its breath. This was it, you see, the moment it all breaks. George and Edward reached Robert in a few long strides. They didn't approach respectfully. They flanked him, one on each side, casting long shadows over the name he was touching. "All right, old man, that's enough," George said, his voice artificially deep. "On your feet. You're blocking the path." Robert didn't seem to hear him. His focus was entirely on the granite, on the name. He was lost in a memory, 50 years deep. "Jimmy," he whispered again. "I'm sorry." Edward was less patient. He reached down and grabbed Robert's shoulder. "Hey, did you hear him? Get up, now." The grip was hard, and it startled Robert from his reverie. He cried out, a small gasp of pain as his bad knee locked and his shoulder was wrenched. "Get off me." Robert tried to scramble up, but his leg wouldn't cooperate. He was clumsy, half kneeling, half falling. "What's the problem?" he stammered, looking between the two tall, angry young men. "The problem," Edward spat, "is you. You can't be kneeling here. And we told you about that cap. It's disrespectful. Take it off." "No," Robert said. The word was quiet but absolute. "What did you say?" George asked, stepping closer. "I said, no, you can't have it." "It's not a request," George said, his own anger rising. He felt foolish, being defied by this frail old man. He reached out fast and snatched the cap from Robert's head. "Hey!" Robert cried, lunging for it, but he was too slow and his balance was gone. He stumbled forward, catching himself against the wall, his hands splayed across the names. "Give it back." "Look at this thing," George said, holding it out, laughing. "It's disgusting. It's probably got lice." He made to throw it on the ground. "That's enough." A new voice. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a shout. It was a command. It was a voice that didn't need volume to be obeyed. A voice forged in authority. Colonel Andrew Vance had turned the corner and taken in the scene in less than a second. Two of his memorial guards laughing, holding a veteran's cap, while the old man himself was pressed against the wall, trembling. "What is the meaning of this?" Andrew said. his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. George and Edward froze. Their bodies went rigid, their faces pale. The laughter died in George's throat. "Sir," George stammered, trying to hide the cap behind his back. This man, sir." He was being disorderly, defacing the wall. He pushed Officer Edward. Colonel Andrews' eyes were like ice. He looked at Edward. "He pushed you?" Edward, realizing the lie, could only nod dumbly. "Yes, sir. We were asking him to move along." Andrew looked at Robert, who was breathing hard, his hand still on the wall, his thin gray hair exposed to the biting wind. Andrew's gaze was stern. He was ready to believe his men. He was ready to tell this old man, this civilian, that he had to obey the rules. He opened his mouth to speak, to reprimand Robert. But then he stopped. His eyes hadn't been on Robert, they had been on the cap, still clutched in George's hand. George, sensing the colonel's attention, brought it forward, as if offering evidence of the old man's squalor. "See, sir? It's filthy." He wouldn't take it off. Andrew took the cap from George's hand. His expression was unreadable. He turned it over, his gloved fingers feeling the worn fabric. And then he saw it. Pinned just above the faded brim, almost invisible against the gray cloth, was a small, tarnished badge. It wasn't a standard-issue pin. It was dark, intricate, and utterly unmistakable to a man like Andrew. The world, for Colonel Andrew, seemed to tilt on its axis. The wind, the hum of the city, the sniffling of the guards, it all vanished. All he could see was the badge. He recognized it instantly from history books, from hushed legends at the academy. It was the insignia of a MACV-SOG unit, Studies and Observations Group, ghosts, men who had operated so far outside the wire, in places they officially never were, that their missions were still classified. Men who had a casualty rate approaching 100%. Men who were legends. Andrew's breath caught in his throat. He looked from the badge to the old man's face, really looking at him for the first time. He didn't see a bum. He saw a survivor. He saw a hero. Without a single thought, driven by a reflex deeper than breathing, Colonel Andrews' back straightened, his chin tucked and his arms snapped up in the sharpest, most profound salute of his career. His heels clicked together. The sound was like a gunshot in the morning silence. The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier than the granite. George and Edward just stared, their mouths hanging open. This did not compute. Their brains were blue screening. They looked at the colonel saluting. They looked at the old man who was just watching the colonel, his breathing still ragged. A salute? For him? George whispered, "Sir." "What?" The colonel did not move. He held the salute. His eyes locked on Robert. He held the position of attention with such rigid devotion that it seemed carved from the same stone as the memorial. He was saluting the man, and he was saluting the cap which he still held in his other hand. Robert slowly pushed himself off the wall. He stood as straight as his broken body would allow. He looked at the colonel, and for the first time that morning, his eyes were clear. He saw the salute. He saw the understanding. He slowly, painfully, raised a trembling hand, not in a salute. He was a civilian now, but in a gesture of acknowledgement, a small, grateful nod. Andrew finally slowly lowered his hand. He turned his head, his eyes fixing on George. His voice was a razor. "What is your name, guard?" George Miller, sir." "And you?" Edward whispered. "Edward Riley, sir." "Officer Miller, Officer Riley. You are to report to the Park Service Liaison Office immediately. You will wait for me there. You will not speak to anyone until I arrive. Am I understood?" "Sir, but—" George started. "Am I understood?" Andrew's voice didn't rise, but it hammered the words into the cold air. "Yes, sir," they both said, their arrogance completely shattered, replaced by a cold, dreadful fear. They turned and almost ran, stumbling away down the path. The two young guards disappeared around the corner, their footsteps echoing their panic. Andrew was left alone with Robert. The wind returned, whistling softly, as if the world was resuming its spin. The colonel looked at the cap in his hand. He handled it with a reverence that was almost painful to watch. He gently, respectfully smoothed the brim. Sir, Andrew said, his voice now quiet, stripped of its command and filled with something else. Respect. Awe. I cannot begin to apologize for the behavior of those men. It is an embarrassment to the uniform, to this place. Robert just shook his head, his gaze returning to the wall, to panel 23E. They're just young, Robert rasped, as if that explained everything. Andrew stepped forward, holding out the cap. They're ignorant, Andrew said, his voice tight with a suppressed anger. They see the uniform, but they don't understand the sacrifice. They stand guard, but they don't know what they're guarding. Robert finally took the cap. His trembling fingers brushed against the colonel's gloved hand. He slowly placed the cap back on his head, pulling it low, putting the world back into its proper shadow. He felt whole again. The colonel stood beside him, not as an officer to a civilian, but as one soldier to another. The difference in their clothing, in their age, in their physical state, it all melted away. They were just two men, bound by a shared understanding of what those names on the wall really meant. They stood in silence for a long time. The few tourists gave them a wide berth, sensing the gravity of the moment. Finally, Andrew broke the quiet, his voice gentle. "Who were you visiting, sir? If you don't mind my asking." Robert didn't answer for a moment. He just stared at the name. Then his arthritic finger rose, and he pressed it against the cold, black stone. "Sullivan," Robert whispered. "James R. Sullivan. He was my radio man." Andrew nodded, his eyes tracing the name. He stood at ease, a silent honor guard for Robert's grief. The story wasn't over. The guards would be disciplined. The colonel would file a report. But here, at the wall, the world had been righted. The laughter had been silenced by a salute, and the two old soldiers stood watch, leaving you to wonder, what promise had Robert finally kept? And what did the two young guards, sitting in that cold office, finally understand about the cost of the ground they walked on?